The Russians seem to be making a play to attack Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, and one that is in northeastern Ukraine, close to the Russian frontier. They've been hitting it from the air pretty hard, and I think they would take it by ground if they have the forces, but I don't think they do. You're right that it could be a critical juncture, and the reasonable optimistic scenario, but a reasonable one, is that if the Russians push hard now to try to push back the Ukrainians before the supplies arrive, they might not succeed. Now, they could. Wars are filled with surprises, but it is possible that the Ukrainians will hold, that the situation is difficult but not dire, and hopefully by the summer, the situation could look better for the Ukrainians.
Now, Ukraine's President Zelensky has said Russia is taking advantage of the slow delivery of Western weapons to go on the offensive. His comments came after the US agreed to a $60 billion package of military aid for Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky said some of the aid had started to arrive, but he added that it needed to be delivered much faster. He was speaking alongside the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who said that several members of the alliance have not delivered what they've promised to Ukraine in time.
NATO allies have not delivered what they promised. The United States spent months not agreeing a package for Ukraine, and European allies have not delivered the amount of ammunition they promised. And this has had serious consequences on the battlefield. The lack of ammunition has enabled the Russians to push forward along the front line. Lack of air defense has made it possible for more Russian missiles to hit their targets. And the lack of deep strike capabilities has made it possible for the Russians to concentrate more forces. And we see the consequences of that now.
Well, meanwhile, the Duchess of Edinburgh has become the first member of the royal family to visit Ukraine since the Russian invasion. She went on a one-day visit to demonstrate solidarity with the women, men and children impacted by the war. Let's talk to Daniel Fried, a former US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, also a former US Ambassador to Poland. Good evening, Daniel.
Good evening.
It was a pretty clear warning there from Jens Stoltenberg about the fact that military supplies are not getting through, are not being delivered in time, and the effect that that's having.
Well, the delay in the congressional appropriations, so slowing, if not halting, U.S. supplies to Ukraine has consequences. And the weapons are flowing, according to the administration, but it'll take time for those weapons to reach the front and be incorporated and be useful. That time should not be too long.
So you think it is, you think it is just a question of time, because we've only recently, a week and a bit ago, had that agreement in Congress to release that big package of $60 billion of military aid. You think that that is on its way? It just hasn't actually physically reached Ukraine yet?
It has, I believe it has physically reached, some of it has physically reached Ukraine. That is, it's my understanding that the U.S. military placed some of that stuff close to the Polish-Ukraine border in a position to move in rather quickly. Now, it still takes some time for it to move from the Polish frontier to the front lines, but some of this was ready to go. It's not as if the U.S. is going to start some laborious process of acquiring the stuff. They had done their homework, and of course, the long-range ATACMS missiles that are very useful for hitting deep targets inside Russian-occupied Ukraine have already been delivered to Ukraine, and they're at work.
Well, I was just going to ask you what sort of equipment is in that big package. So part of it is those missiles. So they are slightly longer range missiles that can be fired into Russia. I mean, what other equipment is on its way?
Well, first to correct it, yes, those longer-range missiles could be fired into Russia, but it's the U.S. intention that they be used for targets inside Ukraine, including occupied Ukraine. And there are plenty of targets. The Ukrainians can go after Crimean military facilities, the Kerch Strait Bridge, and other Russian supply choke points, so they can be used quite effectively. As I understand it, the package includes everything from military shells, anti-armor, armored vehicles, drones. It's a panoply of stuff that the Ukrainians desperately need and can make good use of. It'll have to get there. But even with this 6-month delay in the U.S. supplies, the Russians made advances, but no major breakthroughs. And I can't call that good news, but it does show that the Ukrainian lines held, and it is possible that the Russians, if they push the offensive, will not succeed. Battlefields always include surprises, but the situation is serious, but yet not dire.
Well, it's interesting you say that because we also heard Jens Stoltenberg there talking about the fact that supplies are getting through not from the US but from some of the other European members of the NATO alliance. And we've had that admission, haven't we, from one of the senior commanders in Ukraine that the Russians have been gaining ground.
They have indeed been gaining ground. That's true. The Ukrainians have been upfront about this. My point was only that we have not seen Russian breakthroughs of the sort that the Ukrainians had in the fall of 2002, where the Russian lines collapsed in Kharkiv province. That has not happened. The Ukrainians have been pushed back. And by the way, you're quite right that non-U.S. NATO allies have been sending quite a bit of good equipment to Ukraine. I'm thinking of the Czech artillery shell consortium or the German effort to get Patriot systems to Ukraine. Now, the British, the Poles have done a lot, other countries too. So it's not that the Ukrainians are completely starved, but the lack of the flow from the United States did make a difference. And now, hopefully, that will be rectified and the Ukrainian position can start to improve.
So are we reaching a critical point now in this war? Because, yes, we've seen some gains by the Russians, the Ukrainians desperate to try to push them back to prevent them from taking any of those major cities, more kit and equipment on the way.
Well, the Russians seem to be making a play to attack Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, and one that is in northeastern Ukraine, close to the Russian frontier. They've been hitting it from the air pretty hard, and I think they would take it by ground if they have the forces, but I don't think they do. You're right that it could be a critical juncture, and the reasonable, optimistic scenario, but a reasonable one, is that if the Russians push hard now to try to push back the Ukrainians before the supplies arrive, they might not succeed. Now, they could. Wars are filled with surprises. But it is possible that the Ukrainians will hold, that the situation is difficult but not dire, and hopefully by the summer, the situation could look better for the Ukrainians. But there are no guarantees. This is a war. We've got to be clear that the enemy gets a vote, as they say.
And just finally, we've had the Duchess of Edinburgh, the first member of the British royal family, visiting Ukraine. She's saying that she's there to demonstrate her solidarity with the women, men and children impacted by the war. And she also actually met President Zelensky. Now, I mean, it's symbolic, but it is, isn't it, an important gesture of the support that there still is for Britain for Ukraine?
Oh, yes. Look, I was in Kyiv about a month ago, and the Ukrainians need to see their friends. They need to know that they're not alone. I was there before the Congress voted the assistance, so they were worried about the steadiness of the United States. But that kind of support, a member of the British royal family going to Ukraine and sharing the risks, is an act of solidarity that will make a real impression on the Ukrainians. The message is, you're not alone, we do stand with you. And frankly, I think a lot of Ukrainians will remember the behavior of the British royal family in 1940, which was heroic, and I think the Ukrainians will understand that this is a serious gesture. It will mean something to them.
Daniel Fried, former US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.